Hey folks, PCoutcast here, back with another episode of 6 Days of Snow. So this should be day 6, I assume, unless it's not actually 6 days. This'll be it. So let's see. I had not seen Riko the previous day, and I did not see her the following day either. Once again, it was Yoshiko, kindly, dependable Yoshiko, who served me breakfast and cleared away the dirty plates. I enjoyed Yoshiko's company, and she was very easy to talk to, but it wasn't quite enough. She wasn't Riko. I went for a walk around midday after staring most unproductively at a sheet of paper blanker than the inside of my head. The walk, however, did little to improve my mood. I couldn't compose, I could hardly even think. My brain was full to bursting, and what little snatches of poetry I managed to summon forth were far too overwrought, melodramatic, melancholic. I kept thinking about Riko. I thought too of my own impending departure from the Azami Inn. I had only ever intended to stay for 6 days, and those days were nearly over. This day was to be my last full day at the inn. Tomorrow I would return, and I might not get a chance to see Riko again. I would go, and we not even be able to say goodbye, because Miss Kakeuchi would not permit it. It would be rather sad, a rather sad premature end to our, not love affair, because nothing had happened between us to warrant the lurid connotations the word affair, and there was no love, there was just fondness on my part and a dash of pity, and yes, I did think Riko was pretty. She was incredibly pretty, but I didn't love her. That was what I had to tell myself as I walked through the forest, snow crunching beneath my sandals. I did not love Riko because I could not afford to. I was too old to love so impulsively, and in any event, we hardly knew one another. The age difference was too great, and we were too far apart in experience, and I had Sachiko. Riko, meanwhile, had her mother. It was for the best, surely, if Riko stayed with Miss Kakeuchi. Miss Kakeuchi loved Riko more than I ever could. She loved her so greatly, she would never let Riko go. This thought was so very upsetting, I found myself sighing. It was a deep sigh, pulled from the very depths of my lungs, that left me feeling breathless and almost dizzy. I glanced around. I was surrounded by snow in every direction. It was pure and white and unblemished. It seemed like the landscape would never change, but I knew that was a lie. There was nothing more mutable than snow. When the first snow falls, we feel that it will last forever, but winter always inevitably gives way to spring. One day, a day I would not witness, because I would be back in Tokyo, the snow around the Azami Inn would melt, ushering in flower blossoms in the sunlight of spring, and Riko. She would still be here, trapped. When I thought of what Riko would do after I left, the hurt was so keen I felt like my heart had been pierced with a needle. But I still did not love her. I repeated this in my head like a mantra. It was a tessellating pattern that could duplicate itself indefinitely, or infinitely, until the end of time. I did not love her. I could not love her. You know, there are different types of love. I resigned myself to spending my last day at the Azami Inn in a state of deep unproductiveness, doing nothing, thinking little, and feeling far too much. I hadn't managed to write a single word I would like to keep, and my relationship with Sachiko didn't feel sufficiently healed. If anything, I had thought about her so little during the week she'd become akin to a ghostly stranger in my head. Tokyo was filled with ghosts. Everything became muted, pale, and unimportant when contrasted with Riko. But I was never going to see Riko again. It was probably better that way, I tried to tell myself. There was nothing I could really do for Riko, and seeing her face one last time would only upset me. It would upset her too. So I tried to put her from my mind, but it was hard. It felt like a shard of ice had been embedded in my heart. The ice linked me to Riko, and I couldn't stop myself from thinking of her, even as I told myself countless times I wouldn't. If anybody understands the human condition and all its self-defeating attempts to manufacture misery, it is Hans Christian Andersen. His fairy tales, though nominally tales for children, speak of great sadness. The tin soldier who perishes in a fire with his paper ballerina, the little mermaid who turns into foam, the matchstick girl who dies on the streets, cold and sore and painfully alone. Perhaps these kinds of stories where nothing works out in the end and good people don't receive what they deserve are the sorts that should be told to children. We need to teach them from youth the true nature of the world. Things are not fair. Perhaps if Riko had heard such stories whilst growing up, she wouldn't have hoped her own life could conclude with a happily ever after. It was because she hoped that she hurt. If she stopped dreaming of an escape, maybe she could accept her lot in life with a bowed head and solemn sigh. But still, she kept on hoping. I wonder if I had encouraged her hopes. Had my arrival at the Azami Inn added metaphorical wood to the proverbial fire? In the grand scheme of things, we were still strangers. We'd only spoken on a handful of occasions, and we knew precious little about one another. I was only obsessed with Riko because she was young and pretty and interesting, like a heroine from a Soseki novel. She was so pure and perfect it seemed impossible she would meet with anything other than an unhappy ending. Being a writer, I had a certain affinity for unhappy endings. Riko, meanwhile, was only giving me attention because she had nobody else to give attention to. I was her last resort, the end of the line, so to speak, before the tracks were swallowed by the snow. She did not love me. She could not love me. I could not love her either. I kept telling myself over and over. But still, if I was younger, I'd have written a poem about her just as I had written one for Sachiko. Mine and Sachiko's first kiss was forever commemorated with the blooming of 100 once-were fireworks. But I knew I shouldn't write a poem for Riko. That would seem like too much of a betrayal. It would hurt Sachiko were she to find out, and what could a mere poem do? It was a pretty little idea that didn't amount to anything. It wouldn't help anything, it wouldn't change anything. All it could do was stroke my own ego. We writers are characterized by gross indecision. When we feel anxious, we prefer to confide our thoughts and feelings to a piece of paper. Unfortunately, this does little practical good. It never solves our problems, it only serves to immortalize them. What use is art if it has no genuine use to the general public? Perhaps all my art then was useless, a complete waste of time. Such were my thoughts as I sipped a cup of lukewarm green tea Yoshiko had brought me and looked out at the snowy landscape. It was snowing again. The flakes were being whipped about by the wind as they fell through the air. The sight was enough to make me feel sleepy. I yawned, setting my cup of green tea to one side. I was being foolish. Beyond foolish. It was my last night at the Azami Inn. I shouldn't have been spending it in such a maudlin way, staring at the falling snow and contemplating my own helplessness. This inn, if it was famous for anything, was most renowned for its hot springs. It would have been ridiculous if I failed to make use of these facilities while I was here. I wouldn't get another chance. I was never going to come back. And so with this thought in my mind, I rose to my feet and attempted to shed my selfish self-indulgence. I was already a writer, wasn't I? That should have been selfish and self-indulgent enough. I made my way to the springs, ready to relax in the hot water as I let it... what? Wash away my anxieties? Such a thing would only have been possible if the water was hot enough to induce amnesia, but I tried to be hopeful. Soon I knew I would be back in Tokyo, but for now, I was still in the countryside where it was so quiet you could hear your own heart beating if you listened hard enough. The sound of my own heart mingled with my footsteps against the falling snow. It was a beating rather placidly. with little to stimulate or excite it, but when I arrived at the hot spring, a towel around my waist and my exposed skin prickling in the cold air, I received something of a shock. I wasn't alone. Okay. There, standing in the spring, looking up at the moon with an almost religious reverence, was Rico. The water barely reached her knees. It left the rest of her body completely exposed. Her flesh was dyed soft, milky white beneath the light of the moon. I could see everything, for she had not yet realized I was here, and I had made no motion to cover herself. Her small breasts tipped with two pale pink nipples like cherry blossoms, the gentle curves of her hips as the segued into her thighs. Segued? The fine curve of her calves, slightly distorted by the water, the bumps of her spinal column beneath her skin. For a few moments I could do nothing, say nothing. All I did was stare. I thought I would not see Rico ever again, but there she was, standing before me like some kind of fairy. She seemed too perfect to be real. She was so small, slender, and delicate I feared she might evaporate into mist. Moisture trickled down Rico's body, droplets of water clung to her back, her chest, and beaded inside the hollow of her belly button. Droplets of water clung to Rico's smooth, white cheeks like imitation tears. Or maybe she really was crying. I didn't know. She was a vision of striking beauty, superimposed against the night sky, but it was a discomforting beauty that belied a deep, desperate sadness. As Rico looked at the moon, her eyes upturned, her long eyelashes fluttering, it seemed to me that she was dreaming. She was dreaming, and her dreams showed clearly about her face. They shone in her eyes like stars. She was dreaming of a new life. A better life. She wanted to live the rest of her days in a land far removed from this one, where she could be free of her mother, the weight of her expectations, and the constant crushing fear that she wasn't quite good enough. She would never be good enough. No matter how hard Rico tried, she couldn't accept the full weight of Miss Kakeuchi's loneliness. It wasn't possible. So Rico buckled. Of course she did. But running away will only get you so far. I watched her, lost in my own thoughts, but I had the most curious feeling that my thoughts were no longer my own. How could they be when they all centered around Rico? Everything that I had, I wanted to give to her. I just wanted to see her smile. I know it sounds cliché, but I had tarried too long and the moment had passed. Rico started, her eyes widening with surprise. Maybe she was alerted to my presence by a soft sigh or a subtle shift in the atmosphere, I don't know. In any event, she turned, her dark hair fluttering, and stared. Her eyelashes trembled. Ichi? She said, stammering. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, she still used my birth name like we were close friends. Iji, she said again, and she swallowed, her throat convulsed, and a bead of moisture slid down her slender neck. How long have you been there? Her tone was less accusatory than I had expected. Even more unexpected yet, Rico did not ask me to leave. In fact, it seemed with her gently flushing face and down-turned eyelashes she was inviting me to stay. Maybe she wanted me to see her. Who else did she have to show off to, after all? She didn't have anyone. But that was more troubling to me than shocked gasps and embarrassed tears would have been. If Rico had asked me to go, I would have obliged, because that was how things should have been. It was correct and proper, and most importantly of all, it was understandable. This, however, I could not understand. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what Rico wanted me to do. I wanted to stay with her, I wanted to hold her, to take her, but I couldn't. I felt at that moment, as I stood by the edge of the springs, that I was dangerously close to getting what I wanted. And that thought terrified me. Truthfully, I think I was more scared than she was, so maybe that's why I left. I'd been preparing to sleep when I heard it. It was a series of soft, breathy sobs, so quiet I at first thought I'd imagined it. I turned over on my futon, eyes sewn tightly shut, and tried to force myself into slumber. But again, just above the moaning of the wind, I heard it. There was a gasp, which was then muffled as though by a sleeve or fingers. It was a belated effort, however, because I had already heard it. It appeared that there was a little lost ghost meandering about outside my room. I could envision it clearly, surprisingly so, perhaps, considering I'd never met a ghost before. It seemed inevitable, however, that my little ghost would have long, dark hair and pale brown eyes with a tiny pinhead of a mole beneath the left. I knew, even before I rose to my feet and opened the door, who the interloper was. Iji? My little ghost gasped and took a few shuffling steps backwards. The tatami floor creaked in protest. Maybe the inn was lonely, too. Rico, I said, and then my face flushed. I couldn't help but remember our earlier encounter. How could I not? Ever since I had seen her in the hot springs bathed in the moonlight, I had scarce been able to think of anything else. Though I'd tried to sleep, I couldn't. It wasn't possible. My head was so full with thoughts of her. Too full. I should have sent her away. I knew I should have, even as she stood there looking at me shyly beneath her eyelashes, but I couldn't. Not when it was obvious at a glance that she'd been crying. She was still in the process of crying, in fact, because her eyes were brimming with tears. I'd never wanted to hug her more than I did at that moment. I'm sorry if I was bothering you, said Rico, looking down at her feet. I mean, after what happened, you probably don't want to see me. It's not that I don't want to see you, I said, my voice strained, but look, I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about this, and your mother, my mother isn't here. What if she found out you'd get in trouble? And that was to say nothing of the difficulties I would find myself in. Though I didn't particularly like Miss Kakeuchi, every day I resided within her inn, I'd grown to like her less and less. I couldn't deny I was slightly scared of her. I imagine a lot of men were. But I wanted to see you, said Rico, her lower lip trembling. I was afraid you didn't want to see me anymore after you ran. I didn't run. Well, walked briskly then, Rico amended with a watery little smile. The smile didn't last. Good and pure things never do. I don't know, she said, sniffing. I seem to burden everybody. And I'm never good enough, and it's too late for this, and I'm probably getting in your way. I should go. No. I frowned, stunned at my own suddenness. I think Rico was surprised, too, because she flinched. I paused, drawing breath. I didn't want to scare Rico, especially not when she looked so anxious already. Her eyes seemed far too big for her face, and her body hunched in on itself. Rico, I swallowed. My own spit tasted strange, like cotton wool. It's obvious that you're upset, and if you want to talk to me, I'm here for you. I don't want to cast you out in your hour of need. But you're a guest. I shouldn't be inconveniencing you, really. If you were being an inconvenience, I wouldn't be inviting you into my room. Do you really mean it? You'll invite me in? Of course. Let's make amends, please. The word please truly was a plea. It sounded so desperate even to my own ears, that it hurt. Will I be able to look back on the shameful story in the future, a future further away than the current, and laugh? I hope so. The only virtue of these immature follies are the amusing anecdotes they birth that can be shared around a dinner table. But I was, and am, much too old to know better, and I have no desire to share these stories with anyone, least of all Sachiko. Come inside and tell me why you were crying. Rico sniffed and wiped her eyes with her sleeves, but yet more tears began to trickle from the corners of her eyes. Somewhat lamely, Rico protested, I'm not crying. If such a feeble lie didn't bother to call her bluff, that would have been ungentlemanly. All right, I said softly. I was humoring her, perhaps, but it was better than flat-out condescent. Why can I not pronounce that? Condescension? Condescension, I guess. Though the two are closely related. I moved to one side and Riko entered my room, sliding the door behind her quietly. The sound of the door sliding shut was almost drowned out by the howling of the wind and the falling of the snow outside. So, this is what I said. An anticlimactic lead-in, perhaps, as the two of us sat at the katatsu. What's wrong? Oh, Riko sniffled, wiping her eyes. It's nothing. It was not the most convincing of lies. Looking back on it, I'm not sure it was meant to be. Is it about the hot springs? I ventured. Are you embarrassed? No, said Riko, shaking her head. I mean, well, maybe a bit, but it's just a human body. I don't think it should be shameful. Maybe not, but... My voice trailed off. It was just a human body, true, but there was no denying Riko's body was beautiful. I wasn't sure how to phrase that without sounding lecherous, though. In the end, I decided it was best to leave this musing unspoken. I didn't want to make Riko uncomfortable. You know, the thing with the hot springs, that was an accident, I said at last, for whose sake, I don't know. Riko nodded. It's fine. It was my fault, really. I shouldn't have been in there. I'm not a guest. And more pressingly, she had been in the men's section of the springs. I knew because I had made sure to check before I went in, and I had checked once again as I left, shamefaced. I didn't point that out, though. It might have sounded accusatory. And what was I trying to accuse her of, anyway? Seduction? Why would a pretty young girl like her try to seduce an older man like me? I wasn't that egotistic. Well, if it isn't the hot springs, it must be something, I prompted. Riko sighed. It's silly, really. I'm ashamed I'm bothering you with this nonsense at all. You don't need to be ashamed. If you're upset, you're upset. We can't help how we feel. Oh, E.G., you're so kind to me, but you're wrong. I should be ashamed. If I'm crying, it's my own fault. It's because I deserve it. You don't deserve to be upset. Why do you think you deserve that? E.G., Riko sniffed. She was trembling. I'm not a good person. No matter what you might think, I'm not a good person. And yet, despite her grief, Riko still tried to keep her voice hushed lest she awoke any of the other guests. While imploring me to believe in her wickedness, she paradoxically proved just how conscientious she really was. That made me care for her all the more. But why do you think that? I pressed, struggling to understand. It isn't because of your mother, is it? Has she been telling you you're a bad person? My mother says I'm the best daughter she could ever wish for, and that she loves me dearly, and that I'm smart and beautiful and talented, said Riku dully, as though reciting a shopping list. Then in the same breath, she tells me I'm lazy and ungrateful and manipulative, and I don't work hard enough, and I never appreciate anything she does for me, not ever. Apparently, both those daughters are me, but I don't know which one. I never know. Riko. I said her name because I didn't know what else to say. My arm hovered uselessly in the air. I wanted to touch her. How badly I wanted to touch her. I wanted to pat the top of her head and run my fingers through her hair and press her close against my chest. Oh, God. But she's right, E.G., said Riko, lifting her face. Her eyes met mine, shining with tears, her eyelashes sticking together. I am manipulative. I don't think you are. But I am. You don't think that because you don't live inside my head. You don't know what I'm really like, but I do, and I know, and I can't stand it. Why? What's wrong? I stared at her, and as I did, I reflected on how much I cared for her and how much that scared me. I hadn't even known her for a week, and the sight of her sad face was enough to make my heart ache in sympathy for her sadness, though it was a sadness I couldn't understand. I am manipulative, Riko repeated, as though saying it twice would make it so. Even now, while I'm talking to you, I'm being manipulative. But what do you mean? Try and explain so I can understand, I pleaded. But because when I sit here with you, looking pathetic, it makes you feel sorry for me, doesn't it? It makes you want to take care of me, and that's what I want, Riko confessed. She looked at me, her eyes imploring. I know you're soft and sentimental, and I know what effect it'll have on you if I act like this, and I know it'll make you worry, but still I keep doing it. Well, perhaps you are manipulating me then, I said, but why does it matter? Perhaps I want to be manipulated. Oh, E.G., you're so silly. Rico sniffled, but I swear I could see the ghost of a smile, watery though it was. That smile, however brief, gave me hope. Oh, Rico, I said, parroting her in a childish manner, you're so silly. You're overthinking far too much. Maybe, but, she sniffed, wiping her eyes with the backs of her arms. I know all human interactions are just manipulations, really. We all act in certain ways to achieve certain results. I just don't know if other people are as callous as I am. You're not callous. You're not even in your 20s yet, for goodness sake. What does being young have to do with anything? Rico asked. You aren't trying to talk down to me, are you? No, and I'm not trying to discount what you're saying either. I'm just telling you, one self-aware teenage girl is hardly a monster. I wondered at the back of my mind whether I was being too avuncular? I have no idea what that word is either. But once I had begun my little lecture, I couldn't stop myself. It's a bad habit. For a relatively unknown writer, I've always had far too much pride in my words, unwanted though they may be. If you really want to be a wicked person, try living a little longer first, I instructed her. It's far easier to hurt people when you're older and have more money and power. I'd rather not live a few more years, or any more years at all. I've lived a perfectly good amount already. You're only saying that because you're young. See, she said, looking at me accusingly. It was an impressive feat, given the snot and the tears. You are looking down on me. Well, maybe a little. I can't help myself, I said, smiling. Not when you're so small. Rico huffed and shied away, her eyes narrowed. Don't treat me like a child. I'm not. You are to me. Oh? And that's why you were staring at me in the hot springs, is it? Because I'm like a child to you? I broke off and swallowed. I looked at my lap guiltily. So she had noticed. I should have given her more credit. You know, what happened earlier in the hot springs, that wasn't a mistake, said Rico. She held her head high, her eyes challenging. My own widened with realization. I stared. I had been right after all. I tried to broach the subject as delicately as I could manage, though I could feel myself getting rather flustered at the implications. You didn't want me to see you, did you? Yes, said Rico firmly. With a distinctive nod of her head, I wanted you to see me. I wanted you to see everything. But why? Because I want you to love me. All of a sudden my throat felt dry, my heart pounded inside my chest uncomfortably. Love you? I repeated. That's right. And you think I could only love you if you show me your body? I think it helps. That's what Yoshiko told me. Yoshiko? What on earth has Yoshiko been telling you? I asked her how to make a man love me, and she said it was always better to show a bit of skin. She said men were weak and couldn't suppress their own urges. She said it would be easier for me because I'm young and pretty, but I don't know about that. I don't know if it worked. I didn't think you'd run away. You mean walked briskly, I corrected her, using her own terminology from before. This, fortunately, fetched another smile to Rico's face. Again, it was a fleeting smile that didn't last. So, E.G., said Rico, her voice serious once more, what do you think? Did it work? Rico. I'd never been in such a situation before, and I had no idea what I was meant to say. I supposed I'd brought it upon myself for inviting her into my room. I could have turned her away. But no, that was a lie. I know I couldn't. I could never have been so cruel to her. Why do you want me to love you, Rico? I asked. Love is a very big commitment, and we don't know each other well enough for that. But we do, Rico insisted. At least I know you. I read your poems. Isn't that enough? They're They're just poems, Rico. That's not me. But... Rico's eyes shone once more with tears. I thought we had a connection. We do have a connection, I said, and I enjoyed spending time with you, but love? That's a big ask, and I'm too old to throw such words around so carelessly. Maybe you can because you're young, but You wrote Fireworks, though. I wrote it 20 years ago, about my wife. But I thought that I was the same person as the narrator in that poem? I shook my head. I'm not that impulsive nowadays. Seeing a naked girl beneath the moonlight, even a painfully pretty one, wouldn't be enough to make me betray Sachiko. I paused, pondering. What could I say about Sachiko? That I loved her too much? But I didn't know if I did. I didn't know what I felt about Sachiko. Ever since I'd arrived at the Izami Inn, I'd only ever been thinking of Riko. Look, I said, suddenly tired. I no longer wanted to talk about my wife. I appreciate the sentiment, but you don't love me either, do you? Riko shifted, suddenly guilty. She bit her lip. But I do like you, Iji. That isn't the same as love, and we both know it. But I just can't help it. Riko suddenly exclaimed, holding one hand against her chest in an impassioned plea. You don't understand. I'm so lonely here, so horribly lonely. I've endured it my whole life, and I don't think I can take it anymore. It gets harder and harder every day, and She trembled. Her whole body was shivering. You made me smile more than anybody else has in years, I think, she said. Her voice was raw, earnest, and open. So earnest it hurt. Riko had no cause to feel so emotional about me. She was a pretty young girl, and I was an old man far past my prime. I'd been somewhat attractive in my youth, but my hair was going gray and my skin sagged. Had Riko been a city girl, born and bred, who was allowed to go to school and have friends and live a normal life, I couldn't imagine her having any interest in me whatsoever. She shouldn't have been interested in me. The fact that I seemingly was the only person who had bothered talking to her like an equal in years was so depressing I could have cried myself. I wanted to cry for her. She was too pretty to ruin her face with tears. So what if I don't love you? Asked Riko, clutching the fabric of her kimono tight between her fingers. I at least like you, and that's more than I can say about most people. You talked to me and told bad jokes, and you made me feel like I mattered. I just want to matter. You do matter, Riko. You matter a lot. But if that's really true, then why don't you love me? She spoke quietly, her head hanging like a snowdrop's, resigned, I think, to an answer in the negative. She already knew before I opened my mouth what I said wouldn't make her happy. It wouldn't rekindle her smile. But I couldn't hurt her any further. I wouldn't let myself. It isn't that I don't love you, Riko, I said, my breath catching in my throat. Like I said, I can't. It wouldn't be right. But I just want somebody to love me. Somebody who isn't my mother. I'm so sick and tired of being treated like a child, she suddenly exclaimed, her voice forceful despite her tears. I want to be loved for who I really am and not who my mother thinks I am. Riko, I can't, I said again, though my heart ached at the very impossibility of it all. Loving you wouldn't be good for me, and loving me wouldn't be good for you. You shouldn't offer yourself to me because you're lonely. It's unhealthy. But Iji... Riko sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her arm. I'm probably going to live here my whole life. I can't move because I don't have any money, and in any case, my mother needs me too much. My mother loves me, and I love her, and though she hurts me, and I hurt her, and we hurt each other, I don't think she could survive without me. She couldn't, and I don't want to upset her. Not when she's done so much for me. I'm going to be stuck here forever. No man is ever going to be interested in me, or if they are, my mother will scare them off. I don't know if you noticed, but she's good at doing that. Like the old man from last year? I asked. How do you know about that? Yoshiko told me. I should have known. Yoshiko loves to gossip, not that there's much else to do around here. Riko glanced about at my room. She looked at the snow falling beyond the window and the scuffed tatami mats and the old katatsu, which with scratches embedded deep into its surface. Idly, she traced a fingertip against one of these scratches in the tabletop. I was thinking, I'm going to die all alone, a loveless old maid, so before that happens, I might as well, she bit her lip, I might as well give myself up to somebody I at least kind of like, even if it's not love. It would be far too depressing otherwise. You don't know that, Riko. You don't know what the future holds. You're still young and you have a long life ahead of you, and you will spend it up here with my mother, because that's what she wants, and I'm too weak-willed to refuse. I wasn't taught how to. I don't have the knack. You seem strong enough to me, I said with a note of wonder in my voice. After all, you're propositioning a man more than twice your age. Riko giggled a little at this compliment. Her face flushed slightly. Not from embarrassment, I think, but happiness. I so loved seeing her happy, even if it was a sad, broken sort of happiness that can only occur in self-conscious little bursts after prolonged bouts of crying. It was a weak, delicate sort of happiness that wouldn't last. But nothing in this world does. Not even Miss Kakauchi or her inn, or the snow around it. Someday, perhaps not someday soon, but someday in the distant future, they would all be reduced to phantoms and firewood. Until that day, however, Riko was trapped. She couldn't leave, and even if she could, I doubted that she would. I think she felt too indebted to her mother, and she worried too much. She worried because she loved her. Riko loved her mother dearly, and her mother loved her, but it was precisely because of this misplaced, painful, poisonous love that Riko was suffering. She was suffering so much she seemed to be wasting away before my eyes, even as she laughed. Her laughter soon subsided into wet hiccoughs. She started to cry again. There were always more tears to be shed. Her eyes had not yet cried themselves dry. I must seem so pathetic. I don't think you're pathetic, I said, but she wasn't listening. It is pathetic, she countered, that I tried to seduce you, I guess. As she said the word seduce, her face flushed so delightfully I found myself feeling quite flattered a girl like Riko had even bothered. I know you have a wife and children, and you're a lot older than me. My children are both older than you. Goodness, Riko shook her head. I'm such an idiot. Just a touch. Some men find that charming. But I'm desperate, you know. I just don't want to be alone. I looked at Riko's hand, which was still tracing shapes against the surface of the katatsu. She'd moved away from the pre-ingrained lines and was forming shapes of her own, swooping curves with no rhyme or reason. For a while, I wondered what it would be like if I fell in love with you and you fell in love with me, and you took me, I don't know, somewhere far, far away, somewhere where we could go and see the fireworks. I think that would make me happy. Thinking about it made me really happy, happier than I've been in a long time. Riko, I said her name, my voice heavy with emotion because I didn't know what else to say. I didn't know how to console her. I could hardly have told her how I really felt, though I was growing more and more certain with every passing second. But I knew that was ridiculous, Riko said with a shake of her head. I was being selfish, asking for too much, I suppose. In any case, it wouldn't work because I don't love you. I don't know if I can. I'd never ask you to. I doubt I'm all that appealing to you, a young girl like you. I don't have much to offer. Yeah, and I wouldn't deserve you anyway. Wouldn't deserve me? What on earth are you talking about now? It's like I said before, I'm not a good person. I act like I'm a good person, but I don't think I am. I'm horribly judgmental, you know? Ah, I said with a small nod of my head. Were you judging me? Riko shifted guiltily, her long lashes fluttering. I thought it was a bit sad, maybe, that an old man like you was taking interest in a young girl like me. I criticized you for it in my head, though I didn't tell you. And I don't appreciate how you talk down to me sometimes, and I think you're a bit pretentious. I bowed my head, accepting all of Riko's barbed remarks. I didn't even try to defend myself. I couldn't. She was right. I was sad for taking an interest in Riko, and I deserved to be criticized. Anyone else would have done the same. As for talking down to her, I couldn't help myself when Riko hadn't lived as long as I, and she had spent the majority of her existence stranded up in the mountains like Heidi, but without the whimsy. The last point she made about my pretensions? I have no excuse. I am, and always have been, horribly pretentious. I think that's wrong of me, though, said Riko, sniffling. Why should I judge you when you've only ever been kind to me? I'm the one who should be judged for trying to manipulate you. I won't judge, I said lightly. Everything you said is true. I hardly have a right. Really? Really. Riko's whole expression shifted from sorrowful self-abasement to a thankfulness so strong I half expected her to kowtow at my feet. E.G., oh, E.G., you're nice, she said, eyes swimming with tears. Nobody has ever been this nice to me before. People should be nice to you. People will be in the future. I'm sure you'll meet a man who's younger than me and more attractive. You just need to give it time. But Riko was shifting, her hands reaching for the obi about her kimono. Her face was a little flushed, her eyes still puffy from crying, but she seemed determined, just as she had been, I supposed, when she stood in the hot springs and waited to see if I would note a chance upon her. Riko, what are you doing? I said you didn't have to. But I want to, she said. I want to give myself to you. But why? You don't love me, you said it yourself. I don't, she said, but I like you a lot, and I don't want you to forget me. I would never forget you, Riko. But I want you. I want you to make me feel a little less lonely and a little more loved, just for one night. If that's not too much to ask. Riko lifted her head to look at me, her brown eyes filled with earnest longing. Please? It was the please that did it, I think. How could I turn her down when she said please? So, she didn't love me. That much had been established. In fact, I think she might have looked down on me. But how did I feel, though? What did I think about this contradictory, silly, desperate, charming and funny and oh-so-lonely little girl who had more womanly wiles than perhaps she realized? I don't know. But I do know whatever it was I felt for her, be it compassion, affection, or just plain pity, encouraged me to bridge the gap between us and pull her unresisting body into my arms. Ah! Riko gasped at the close contact, which had been entirely unexpected. For a few moments I wondered whether I had moved too quickly or else misread the signals. Had I startled her? And yet, after a small pause, Riko's body relaxed and rested her head against my shoulder. I held her all the closer for it, winding my arms around her waist and placing my hands against the small of her back. Her hair tickled my cheeks. It was soft and smooth and, strangely enough, smelt of persimmons? Persimmons. What the heck is that? Some kind of, flower? I don't know. She was so tiny I was half afraid I would break her, or mark her, or bruise her. It seemed with every moment she spent in my arms she was decreasing in value somehow. She was becoming dirty and tainted like snow that had been trodden on. E.G. Oh, E.G. Riko cried all the harder at my unbridled display of affection. I could feel her tears soaking against my shoulder. I'm sorry, she said. I'm going to ruin your clothes. I don't care. Cry as much as you want. That's what I'm here for. Just for tonight, I don't want you to cry again. Riko giggled softly at that and shook her head. Oh, you can say pretty things when you want, she said. If you say things like that, I really might fall in love with you. Riko's limbs were ghostly pale in the gathering gloom. They were so white they almost seemed to glow. She looked like the snow, or to be more precise, she looked like the snow when the early morning sun shines upon it, so it sparkles with heavenly light. She was beautiful, immaculate, unspoilt. But I had spoilt her only a few minutes ago. It had been her first time. I hoped it hadn't been too painful for her. I tried to be as gentle as I could, but Riko had been afraid, and fear has a way of tensing the muscles so everything becomes much more difficult. Riko's eyes were big, like a startled deer's. She had bitten down on her lower lip throughout the whole ordeal in an attempt not to moan. She had largely succeeded, too. She had been mostly silent during our prolonged session of supposed lovemaking. If Riko had managed to moan, I doubted it would have been in pleasure, for she hadn't looked like she was enjoying herself. It had hurt her. Or I had hurt her. I hurt her, but when I recoiled, asking Riko if she wanted me to stop, she shook her head, still biting her lower lip, her hair spilling across the pillow. The motion was almost desperate, as selfish as I had ever seen her over the last 6 days. Though she'd remained silent, Riko's startled eyes communicated what she meant more clearly than words could. Don't. If you do, I won't be able to go through with it. I wanted to tell Riko that it didn't have to be like this. Sex wasn't something to be endured, but something couples often did, surprisingly enough for fun, because they loved one another. But Riko didn't love me. She'd already told me as much. She'd already given me her body. It would have been unfair for me to demand she give me her love too. Following our copulation, I couldn't call it making love. Riko lay by my side, curled up on herself like a grain of rice. The covers pooled about her tiny body, exposing her matchstick arms and legs and concave stomach. Are you really leaving tomorrow, Iji? She asked me, with her voice barely audible above the snow outside. Of course it was snowing. It always snowed in the mountains of Hakuba, particularly during the nights. I have to leave tomorrow, I whispered, my voice equally muted. I have my train tickets, and Sachiko will be missing me. Your wife? I nodded, but didn't say anything more. There was nothing left to say. Riko knew I had a wife. She had known from the beginning because I hadn't kept it from her. I'd seen no reason to keep Sachiko's existence a secret because I had no intentions of tricking Riko in any kind of relationship, illicit or otherwise. That being the case, how had this happened? Despite my best attempts to rebuff her, Riko had wormed her way into my heart. I'd thought I was too old to fall for the charms of a pretty young girl, no matter how wide her eyes or long her lashes. She was more than 20 years my junior, and I already had Sachiko. I know it's a standard cliche that men like pretty young girls, and enough tragic love stories have been written on the subject matter, but I thought myself better than that. Evidently, I had overestimated myself. E.g. Riko sighed softly, her breath was sweet, and it tickled my skin. Though she was lying close to me, she didn't wrap her arms around me. Neither did she entwine her legs with mine. Instead, she kept her distance. She was cautious, like a baby animal. It seemed odd to maintain distance now after we'd been so close, but that moment was gone. All the while, the snow continued to fall, settling in drifts on the dead, scrubby grass outside. Riko? I responded in turn, glancing the top of her head. I know you have to go back, and I know you have to see your wife, but... Riko's words were riddled with pauses. She stopped, seeming to lose her nerve before she started once more. Say what you want, Riko, but I've always... Say what you want about Riko, but I've always thought she was incredible. I think I admired her, just a little. She was so very determined. Would it perhaps be alright if I imagined, only for a little while, that you didn't have to leave so soon and we could stay together a few days more? Riku's eyes flickered in the dark like candles. Her eyes were beautiful, just like the rest of her. They were amber brown, like liquid resin, and looked even browner in the dim light. You can pretend all you want if it makes you feel better, I told her, like some kind of monarch distributing dividends. I winced after I spoke, and I hated myself for it. My heart felt too heavy for my ribcage, and my chest ached. I wanted to give her, oh, so much more, but there were no words, ironic for a writer, and nothing seemed good enough. Riku had suffered too much in her life. It was foolish of me to imagine our meeting might have changed anything. Our relationship had changed precisely nothing, except adding to Riko's loneliness. Then again, what was another drop in the ocean? You know what I have been pretending, Riko said softly, so softly. What? I asked. I've been pretending that when you leave, I'll accompany you to the train station. It will be snowing, of course. Of course. The two of us shared a smile at this, the last smile we would ever exchange, and Riko even laughed. Her laughter sounded rather lonely in the still and quiet of the snowy night. Well, she continued, it'll be snowing, and the platform will be white, and the train tracks too. It'll look so pretty, like something from a fairy tale. It'll be like the mountains are pure and undisturbed, and mankind never laid those ugly steel tracks to begin with, I chimed in. That's right, the tracks will be gone, and I'll let myself believe for a moment, just for a moment, that we've been cut off from the rest of humanity and you won't be able to leave, that you'll stay here with me. Riko frowned, her brow furrowed. But then the train arrives because that's how life is and nothing can last forever. Not even in fantasies? I think I'm too practical. Then it seems like quite a sad fantasy. Oh, it isn't so sad. You'll leave Hakuba and you'll go back to your wife, who's very happy to see you, of course, while I... Riko paused, her eyes were dark with shadows and unspoken worries. I tried to fill in the gaps as best I could. What did Riko have? She had the snow that surrounded her every which way you looked. She had this inn in the middle of the mountains with creaking floors and rattling windows. She had an irate mother who scolded her for every minor misdemeanor while suffocating her with unwanted affection. That was Riko's life, and she had no means of escape. She had no hopes of a better, brighter tomorrow. There would be no happily ever after. I think I would like to kill myself, Riko said. She said it simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. As B comes after A in the English alphabet, the winter becomes spring. Kakuchi Riko would kill herself when I left. Riko, Anxiety seized up my throat. I couldn't talk. Felt like my vocal cords had frozen. Wasn't it embarrassing that I, a grown man, was letting the fancies of a young girl work me up into such a state? But that's why I've always wanted to be a writer, I suppose. I've always been far too passionate, and the suicide of a pretty young girl over a subject as tried and tested as a failed romance couldn't fail to move even the hardest of hearts. Don't worry, E.G., said Riko with a small smile. I won't really kill myself. This is just an imagining. I'm playing pretend. Forgive me, but I always thought playing denoted a certain kind of childish happiness. It's supposed to be a tragic play, said Riko, her eyes boring into mine. I wouldn't know because I've never seen a play, but aren't tragedies popular? The love suicides at Sonozaki are rather popular. So popular, in fact, the government banned performances of the play in the early 1700s after several couples tried emulating the unfortunate ends of Takobai and Ohatsu, with varying degrees of success. Manziamon, in addition to being a master of his craft, managed, quite unwittingly, I'm sure, to usher in an epidemic of tragic twin suicides. If only my stories were that popular. Well, if the characters in famous plays can commit suicide, I don't see why I can't, said Rico, somewhat feverishly. Doesn't it sound romantic? Don't expect me to join you. I have a wife and family to provide for. Like I said, I'm not being serious. I just like the idea of it. It seems very dramatic and very final. I don't know if the thought had crossed my mind before, but Rico could be quite frightening when she wanted. Well, she was her mother's daughter. I see where you're coming from, I said, my throat still choked. In fact, I think I can relate to it. You can? When I was younger, there was a girl I liked. Her name was Miki. I liked her such a great deal, I threatened to kill myself if she didn't go out with me. She refused, as well she might, and, well, I shook my head. As you can see, I didn't go through with it. I'm glad you didn't, said Rico, but wasn't she afraid that you might? Miki? Oh, she hardly knew me, and I hardly knew her either. Then why did you? Because I was childish and immature, and I suppose it sounded exciting. I never had any intention of actually doing it, I just thought she might be impressed. Fortunately, Miki was more sensible than I was, and I saw through my bluff. Oh, Riku's face fell, and I found myself feeling guilty all of a sudden. Do you think I'm being childish and immature? I paused, momentarily caught off guard. Rika was good at unsettling me. It must have been something about those big eyes of hers. I don't think you're immature, Rico, I said, picking my words carefully. Words can be weapons, and I had hurt her more than enough that evening. I would continue to hurt her tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, even when I was nothing more than a memory. Memories can have the sharpest bite of all. But you think I'm childish? She countered, having seen through my selective phrasing. You are a child, Rico. You might be more mature than your mother imagines, but you're still a teenager. But you slept with me, she said innocently. I'm defiled now, so I can't be a child anymore. Children don't do things like that. You weren't trying to prove a point, were you? No, it's like I said. I just didn't want you to forget me. And like I said, I could never forget you, you silly girl. Well, now it's assured, she said, in the same manner children might when talking about pinky promises. If I lie, may I eat 1,000 needles. She was trying to sound mature, I think, and brave and strong, but the discrepancy between her words and her tone, which threatened to fragment, was painful. I wanted to pull her to my chest and hold her tight and run my hands through her hair and tell her everything would be all right. But that would have been a lie. All of it lies. It wouldn't be all right. Not for Rico, whose only solace from the real world was fantasies about suicide. Like I said, I wouldn't really kill myself, Rico repeated. I'm a coward, and I'm scared it would hurt, and my mother would be so very, very angry with me. People would gossip, and she'd think it's some slight against her parenting. Doubt she'd think I'd done it on purpose. I bet she'd think I'd done it on purpose to hurt her. I think your mother is a fool. You're more than the culmination of your mother's parenting techniques. You're your own person. Sometimes I wonder, said Rico, frowning, but I guess suicide would be too much hassle. I don't think that should be the primary reason for not killing yourself. Oh? Rico raised an eyebrow. Isn't that reassuring enough for you, Iji? Doesn't it make you feel better knowing I won't kill myself? I'd rather not talk about you killing yourself at all. It wasn't how I imagined spending my last night in the Azami Inn. But then again, I hadn't imagined I would sleep with Rico either. For a writer, my own imagination seems fairly lacking when compared with reality. But... Riku paused, her expression contorted and her eyes, they were shining as though they contained shooting stars. The tears that gathered in the corners of her amber eyes were constellations, and they quivered shyly, anxious to make their debut. No doubt she was afraid of inconveniencing me. Even if I don't talk about it, E.G., I'll think about it, because thinking about it is the only thing that makes me happy. Though her voice faltered, and 1, 2, 3 of those crystalline tears that were dislodged from their perch, she still didn't succumb to her despair. She didn't allow herself to cry properly, though I'm sure she wanted to, and she didn't cling either. She must have known there was no use. I would leave tomorrow no matter how tightly she held in at the present, and Riku wouldn't accompany me because that wasn't how the world worked. Riku had work to do in the Azami Inn. There was always so much work to do. I, meanwhile, would go to the station with Yusuke. That would be for the best. I wondered, come the following morning, while I sat on the train and Riku busied herself with menial labor, what she would think about. The roar of wheels against iron tracks, her life a dull, mundane thing not worth much by most people's standards, flashing before her eyes. Then nothing at all. I wanted to love her so badly it hurt, but I restrained myself. I had to. If I told her I loved her, that might have been the final straw. It was easy to threaten suicide if you wanted to manipulate somebody. It was, as Riku said, a very romantic thing to do, befitting of a femme fatale like Tanazaki's Naomi. It's far harder to go through with it. But if Riku knew unequivocally, without a doubt, that I really had grown to love her, killing herself after such a confession would have been very appealing, don't you think? It would have been like something from a novel. Like something from a novel I might write. And Riku, for want of friends or family, enjoyed losing herself inside fantasies. That was why I didn't tell her. I couldn't. I loved her far too much. Oh, I'm almost crying. Oh, well, I hope you guys enjoyed the story as much as I did. It's too bad, really, that he slept with her. That's so cliche. But yeah. Well, you know what? I'm not going to say anything about the story. You know, to each their own. That's the real beauty of literature. You know, we all sort of have our own take on it. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you in the next game. Take care.